Welcome to When Technology Goes Wrong. I'm Paddy Dhanda and I head up the product discovery and agile practices here at QA. In every episode, we take a deep dive into a technology fail. We figure out what happened and how we can learn from it. Joining me today is Graham Barrow. Graham's one of the UK's top financial crime specialists. He's the co-presenter of the Dark Money Files podcast and co-founder of Risk Alert 24/7 Limited, a data analytics firm fighting financial crime. And he's also a self-described obsessive about exposing fake companies. We'll come on to that later. Hey, Graham, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paddy. It's great to be here. Looking forward to our conversation very much.
Oh, no. Honestly, I'm really excited for this conversation, Graham. And I know you've been getting over a bit of a virus as well. So I do appreciate you making the time today.
Pleasure. I might sound a little bit croaky at times, but hopefully the voice will last for the duration of the podcast.
No worries. Graham's here to talk about the story of Shiseido, a popular Japanese cosmetics firm. In early 2022, its UK branch experienced a major data breach which compromised the sensitive personal information of hundreds of current and previous employees. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the start, because that data was then used for all sorts of other crime, bank fraud, extortion attempts, and the creation of hundreds of fake companies in victims' names. It's an example of how modern fraud has a ripple effect, which can just keep expanding far beyond the original crime. First of all, Graham, how did you get into all of this?
It kind of started, I got involved for reasons that are just going to be too complex to talk about today, but I got involved in identifying a couple of companies back in the mid-2010s that were instrumental in laundering $10 billion out of Russia. So that was an interesting thing. So as I dived into it, I started working with a couple of journalists in Denmark, and it became a big story about Danske Bank in Estonia and $235 billion of money laundered out of Russia. So that was, you've got to be a bit stone-hearted not to think that's really interesting. And what intrigued me, Paddy, was the fact that there was UK companies that were kind of the heart of all this. So you just said I'm obsessive, and I am. And that just kick-started an obsession with, well, what's going on in the UK? Because I guess like 99% of the people listening to this, you kind of think, well, we have our company's house and they're great companies and they're businesses and it's all rather lovely. And it's not. It's actually a hotbed of criminality once you scratch below the surface, which is what I did.
It's incredible. I mean, you're absolutely right. When we think about Companies House, it's where all of our UK businesses are registered, and you expect that data to be totally secure. Yeah. Could you explain a little bit more about this story and exactly what happened?
So let me take a step back, and we created this. I'm co-founder of this company called Risk Alert 24/7, and the sole point of this company is to monitor in real time both company formations and company filings, with the view to identify what we believe is potentially suspicious and therefore possibly criminal intent. So that was the sole basis. And you might think, what do you want to do that for? Well, if you're a bank that's taking on new businesses daily, hundreds a day, you want to know as soon as possible whether some of those are going to end up costing you money. So that was the thing. And we monitor loads of different potential red flags, one of which is the creation of companies that are very close to each other geographically in a short period of time. Because, everyone in the same street is unlikely to decide within a week to create a company. That's quite anomalous. So we have these flags, the algorithms that say, well, there's some stuff happening in this street or in this postal district that is quite unusual and it's worth a second look. So as you just said, in early 2022, companies started being created that were anomalous. And actually, I can tell you exactly the ones that started me on this journey, if you'd like me to.
Yeah.
And I should add at this point, by the way, we've talked about Shiseido. Actually, to be fair to Shiseido, they're not the only ones. There's another one called Conduent that were also intimately involved. They're all part of the same name network that was used by criminals to create these companies. We'll talk about that in a minute. But back in April 2022 in a road called St Mary's Road in Weymouth, which most people have never heard of, but it's a shopping street in Weymouth, and it is a pedestrian shopping street. And in the course of 3 or 4 days, 3 new companies were set up virtually next door to each other in Weymouth in the high street. And the odd thing was that they had kind of similar names. And then when I looked, they were pretty young people. In fact, 2 of them were teenagers. Now, it piqued my interest. So the first thing I had to look at, well, how much does it cost to rent a shop in this high street? And it was about 80 grand a year, plus another 80 grand a year of rates. You thought, well, that's fair play for a young person still in their teens. And in fact, 3 of them have done it in the same week, virtually next door to each other. And then when I thought one of them was Lloyd's Bank, I thought, that's a really weird place to have a cake shop, So that started me off. And the great thing about what we do is that we can rapidly organise elements that we identify within some companies that we think are suspicious and say, okay, if we take those general elements and we apply them across the board, what other companies have those same suspicious elements, one of which was weird statement of capital. Now, most people would never even look at a company's statement of capital, but actually it's usually £1 or £10 or £100 because that's the capital people start a company. £245 is a really weird one. And when 3 companies in the same street use the same sort of capital, that's really strange. So we kind of started looking at things like that. And then I noticed, because I'm obsessive, these premises, I'm finding all of them are being advertised for rent on, it was called Reala. So Reala was like the Zoopla or the Rightmove for commercial properties. They're all being advertised. They're all empty shops, pretty much, other than a few banks. So that is really interesting. Now, I'm not a tech person. I'm the person who says, can the tech do this? And I'm so lucky because I've got a co-founder who says, yep. And half an hour later, I get a spreadsheet and say, oh, wow, because apparently he thinks in Python. So he said, okay, well, we'll scrape Reala then. So an hour later, we had every listing from Reala in a database, which we then hooked up with Companies House. So at that point on, any company that was created using an address that was on Reala, we triggered. So that was the beginning of it. There's a lot more to tell, but that was where we started. It was like, okay, we need to start monitoring these in real time specifically.
And when it comes to Shiseido, like what really happened there? Yeah. Because I'd love to hear how that then linked into all of
because that's quite a jump, is that we're monitoring these companies and now we're talking about Shiseido and Conduent. And in fact, actually, Conduent was the one that came up first. So I started, and I think within a week or two, we'd got a list of, I'm going to say hundreds of companies within a couple of weeks. So this is substantial. And I'm obsessive. So I sat down and we did an extract of all of the companies. And so I started picking up the ones that had got quite unusual directors' names. Simple reason is the more unusual the name, the easier it is to track down on the internet. And there were lots of really quite unusual names.
I was going to say, what sort of unusual names were we talking about?
Well, there were lots of clearly names of people who clearly weren't natural British born, although all of them were described as British citizens. But some of them, still quite a few Spanish names. But the glorious thing about Spaniards is they have like 17, I'm exaggerating, names, but they have quite a few names. Some of them were clearly Eastern European names. So, where I could see that this was not a common name, I thought, well, I'm going to go looking. So I went looking, and an obvious place to look is LinkedIn because lots of people have profiles. So I did 3 or 4, found them quite easily, and then something clicked and said, "Oh, dear, I keep seeing something. Let me go back and have a look at these profiles again." And every one of the ones had previously been at Conduent. So if it happens 2 or 3 times, you think, by the time I'd collected, I started building a spreadsheet. I'd collected 10 or a dozen, all of whom who were at Conduent. Now, Conduent was actually a subsidiary of Xerox. It's a really, really big company, and they provide contractors. So clearly lots of people work there. But when you're seeing consistently the same company appearing on all of these different directors of these companies being created, CVs, that's odd. So then we started harvesting all of the data and doing that kind of second level OSINT, open source intelligence investigations. And it just started coming through. I mean, we ended up identifying hundreds. And then as things progressed, the Conduent stuff started to die down, but the Shiseido stuff started to come up. Slightly trickier because a lot of the time it would be Shiseido subs. So lots of makeup companies are actually subsidiaries of Shiseido. So both of those really started, it became absolutely obvious that their data was being used. Both current and former staff of both of those were being used to create these companies. And in the end, that was confirmed because I was contacted by solicitors working for both of those firms to ask for me to stop posting on LinkedIn and also to get some more information.
So either all the employees that were opening these companies have just become entrepreneurs overnight, or there was something dodgy going on here.
Yeah, and it was clear they hadn't become entrepreneurs overnight because, I mean, they were lazy and started registering multiple companies to the same address. So they'd have you believe that hairdressers, a cake shop, and a pet suppliers were all operating. Well, that's ridiculous. And then one was a car sale showroom, which was in a pedestrian precinct. So I don't know how that works. So that was clear. But then, as I say, I had first Conduent and then Shiseido's lawyers got in touch and said, could we meet confidentially to talk about A, the stuff that you're posting publicly, and B, maybe how we can work together.
And what happened once the data was stolen? I mean, we see these companies were set up, but what happened in between?
So, I mean, we ought to talk about the stolen because, to be fair, I should say that both Shiseido and Conduent still maintain that they were themselves not breached.
Yeah.
Which kind of begs the question because absolutely without a doubt, all of that data included sufficient personally identifiable data to start a company, which means at least date of birth, national insurance number, probably home address. So clearly identified. So it had all the hallmarks of HR data. Now, whether that was through themselves or through a third party that may have held that data, I don't know. But both of them definitely had a data breach somewhere within themselves or a third party that gave these people access to all the data they needed. So once they got that data, they started creating companies. Thousands of them.
Right.
So at least 2,000 companies were created with that data.
Wow.
At least. Probably more, but at least 2,000.
And look, you raised a really good point there. This podcast isn't about blame. It's really trying to understand the lessons that we can learn and make sure we don't fall into that same trap ourselves. And so, as you mentioned, Shiseido absolutely have denied liability for the data breach, and they say that the data could have been compromised through third parties. So I just want to reiterate that point as well. And look, you mentioned thousands of companies have been created fraudulently. Is this something that happens often?
Yeah.
Like what?
Every day.
Right.
Every single day, companies will be created using either stolen or paid for identity information. Without any doubt whatsoever, it is happening today. And people tomorrow or the next day will have a letter land on their doorstep telling them, congratulations, either your address or your name and address or your name has been used to create a company. And they will look and think, I have absolutely no, and I know this because lots of people get in touch with me because if you do the Google search, you will find my name, to say, oh, I've just had one of these letters. I mean, my next door neighbour had one last year and it was my old house. So she had to deal with it, not me. But two people in my street have had that happen to them in the last 2 or 3 years.
So I'm trying to think, what is the impact of this?
Yeah.
So obviously the data's been taken, companies been set up, say, for example, in my name fraudulently.
Yep.
What impact is that going to have on me and what are some of the consequences?
So it's a really interesting question, Paddy. And people say, well, why bother starting the company? Why not just use the identity, directly? And the simple fact is, it is easier to get fraudulent access to financial products through a company than it is through you personally. Banks are really careful about personal banking. They're not quite so careful, oddly, about corporate banking. So banks have this thing called straight-through processing. And what that means is that in certain criteria, no human beings are harmed in the creation of this bank account. So you can create a company without anybody looking at the details, and then you can start a bank account without anybody looking at the details, as long as it meets certain criteria. Well, all of this stuff that they stole, these were exactly the sort of people who will meet that criteria, which is people with no adverse credit, with straightforward employment, with all of their details provided. That will go straight through on just a credit check, and lo and behold, you've got a company. Then you can use the company to apply for all sorts of financial products, which you have a pretty decent chance of acquiring, or you can use them to get mobile phone contracts, or you can use them to apply for loans, or a whole range of things you can do with them. And I can give you a couple of examples in a minute if you want me to, which is just more straightforward. And of course, the brilliant thing is that the criminals themselves aren't on any of the paperwork. And because Companies House still does not verify any of that data, the banks will, of course, but Companies House doesn't. So that first entry into the financial market through a company is easy, because you can put whatever you like on the company, because nobody will verify that data.
Which, again, just blows my mind.
Yep.
I mean, the fact is you're setting up a legal entity that's going to be trading. And so you think, actually, there should be more rigor behind that, shouldn't there?
Well, it gets even worse, because, as we'll talk about, at that point in 2022, in order to remove your details that have been used fraudulently, some of those details require an order of court to have them taken off the register, even though there are no checks whatever when they are put on the register. So if you wanted to remove your details completely, you had to go to court. Now, what that meant was, when both Shiseido and Conduent realised that they'd had a significant loss of data wherever that happened, it was their employees or former employees whose lives were being trashed by that, because their credit ratings were being wiped out, they were having fraudulent loans applied for, all sorts of stuff. So they had no option but to go to court to get the court orders. Now, from my point of view, fabulous, because I now have incontrovertible evidence it was them, because those court orders are posted to the individual company registers to show why the details were removed. So I have documentary evidence. So I know exactly how many companies were involved as a minimum in this fraudulent exercise. And
look, I've read about different fraudulent company directors being set up. I was doing some reading, and it actually blew my mind. There's directors called Darth Vader and Santa Claus.
Yep. Jesus Christ, is in there as well.
Right. And, you've been documenting some of these crazy companies. So could you give us some more examples of other companies that have been set up in this way?
I mean, possibly my favourite, and it's still there, it's called John Smith 3A Limited. And it's got half a dozen directors, but certainly John Smith lives at any street, any town, anywhere. And that is exactly what appears on Companies House. There's one in Belgium, which is kind of like any street in Belgium. I mean, that's what's on the register. So you think, but that's obviously fake. I think people don't always understand that Companies House then, and to a degree now, are legally obliged to put on the register whatever is sent to them. So the analogy would be, it's a bit like a library. So you send books into the library, and the library just puts them on the shelf. The library doesn't censor what's in the books. It puts them on the shelf, and its only job really is to put them on the right shelf. And that's exactly what Companies House is. It's a librarian for companies. Now, that's starting to change, but hasn't particularly changed in any meaningful way yet. But back in 2022, you create a company, it goes on the register, that's it. And we see some fairly outlandish both company names and there's a remarkable number that look exactly like your local bank might look, or a local, or a national bank, or all sorts of well-known. I mean, famously, there was a lady in Huddersfield who had Asda Limited registered to her house. Now, you might think, well, that's a supermarket. No, they're called Asda Stores Limited. So Asda Limited wasn't, and there's nothing to stop it being registered. She ended up with 7 kilograms of post, most of which was from bailiffs or lawyers, because whoever set up the company then started buying all sorts of stuff, and people thought they were selling it to Asda, and of course they weren't, and then didn't get paid. And the bailiffs would turn up, and she's, it's a 2-bedroom terraced house in Huddersfield. Do you really think this is the Asda store's headquarters? Because clearly it's not. So the bailiffs were saying, well, Asda owed this. It's not Asda, But that's the kind of damage you can do with a company.
I mean, I'm sort of smiling now, but I'm just thinking, if that were to happen to somebody, just the stress and the kind of anguish that you would be feeling would be incredible. You've got these bailiffs knocking on your door, demanding things that you haven't actually done, right. Haven't purchased or haven't done anything wrong. So
kind of the most chilling one, which was one of these companies, and I can't remember. I think it was a former Shiseido, but it was one or the other. But that was the start. So I did some work with a wonderful lady called Shari Vard on Radio 4, and she went out and started trying to find some of these people, because obviously, having the accreditation as a BBC journalist gives you access to people that I don't have just as an ordinary citizen. Anyway, she found this particular lady, and her story, I'll never forget the story, because this lady explained that one morning she had a phone call from NatWest, and very nice chap on the other end said, "Morning, just ringing you because we believe that you've been subjected to a fraudulent loan application. £3,000 has just come into your bank account this morning, but we actually think that's fraudulent. So can you just check that we're right, and can you confirm whether you applied for that loan?" And so she went. Sure enough, there was £3,000 in her bank account, and sure enough, she'd never applied for a loan. So she said, "No, this is nothing to do with me." So a very reassuring voice at the other end said, "Okay, well, look, leave it with us. We thought that was the case, but we'll just now inform the right people, and I'll come back a bit later today and let you know what we need to do." Hung up, and I don't know what it was, but this wonderful lady, she thought, I'm not completely happy about that. So she went, she rang NatWest and said, "Oh, hi, you've just been on the phone to me." And they said, "No, we haven't." She said, you rang and you told me that I got this fraudulent loan." So I said, "Well, hold on a minute." Went through security. And but actually, if you think about it, I think she went through security. So this person rang up, just to rewind. When this person rang up, they went through, "Can you give me character 2 and character 6 from your passcode?" Which she did. And they said, "Oh, yes, fine, thanks very much." But because if you're rookie, you say whatever you like. And so actually, one of the things I do now is deliberately give the wrong answer first time round. Because if it is my bank, they'll say, "No, that's not right." And if it's a scammer, they'll say, "Oh, thank you very much," and then I'll know it's a scam because I've just deliberately told you the wrong thing. Anyway, but NatWest said, "No, we haven't rung you," and we actually had no suspicions about this loan whatsoever. It's like you've applied for a loan and it's appeared in your account. So, well, I haven't actually, but anyway, so she left that with NatWest, and a little while later the phone went, and this very nice voice came back on and said, "Oh, hi there, it's NatWest, and thank you for all your help. Just take you through security again." Yeah. And they said, "Okay," so we looked into this, and it's completely fraudulent, and so we have a special account that we send all this fraudulent money to. So I'm going to give you a sort code and an account number, and all you need to do is forward this onto this account, and everything will be fine. And she said, "No, I'm not going to do that because I now know you're not NatWest." And the voice at the other end said, "No, we're not. But on the other hand, we know where you live and we know your children's names. And if you don't do this, we will hurt them." And that's when you realise that this woman who had no agency in any of this, she wasn't responsible for her data being stolen. She wasn't responsible for a company being formed. She wasn't responsible for the application for the loan. And yet, there we are now. She is being threatened with potentially the lives of her kids over something that she had no agency over, which is absolutely terrifying. Bless her, she still refused to do anything about it, and everything was fine. It was an empty threat. But that's the point. You realise we can talk about data breaches and all the rest of it, yeah, but then you talk about the downstream consequences of that, and the fact that criminals aren't interested really in stealing data. That's not the name of the game. It is what the data can do for them. And they're incredibly inventive in how they can use that data to enrich themselves, including applying for loans on behalf of other people and then getting it sent to their account to make it look completely legitimate. And that's on top of the thousands of mobile phone contracts and other loans. And I mean, one person had 50 credit reference checks in the space of about 2 weeks. I mean, if someone's going to trash your credit rating, that will do it.
Graham, why have they not put a stop to this? I mean, it sounds like you've been on this kind of one-man mission to raise awareness of this.
Yeah.
Why hasn't it been stopped?
So let's try and be as fair as we can. As a consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which you might think, what's that got to do with it? But actually, the government pushed through 2 pieces of legislation, the second of which is called the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. And it gives Companies House a whole range of new powers, because at the moment they have no power whatever to do anything about this. You think, well, that's good. And one of those powers is to verify the names, but not the addresses, of people applying to create a company. So I get asked a lot, well, that's going to make a difference, isn't it? Well, let's think about that. So I think 99% of all companies are created for one reason, and that is to get some sort of access to financial products. What's the first thing that's going to happen when you apply for any sort of financial product? You will have to verify your details. So we're not actually asking for anything they won't have to do anyway, just a bit further downstream, because they're going to have to do it. So it'll get rid of some jokers and chances. We'll get rid of the Darth Vaders, self-evidently, because I think you'd struggle to verify Darth Vader. So it'll get rid of some of the kind of the chaff. But the organised criminal network, and that's what we're talking about, organised criminal networks, it's not really going to make any difference. The difference that, the one thing that would make a difference is if Companies House had the power to act prior to a company being put on the register. Because once it comes on the register, frankly, you just download all your documents and you're away. And that is coming in. And then they will then need to have the ability to recognise at speed potentially fraudulent companies. So we've still got a long way to go. And at the moment, we're not even close to being able to do anything about it. And they put the price of creating a company up from £12 to £50, which is still less than it costs to register a new car. So it's not in any way prohibitive. So and I don't think they'd be put off. But I think £100 wouldn't be an unreasonable amount to charge for a new company. And that could properly fund some of the technology that we're going to need to fight these sorts of technology breaches.
And is this purely a UK problem? Like, how do other countries deal with this?
That's a good question. So I think there are unique elements in the UK, one of which is that we are the only register in the world which is fully accessible and completely free to anybody to access. Now, in a way, that's both brilliant because it allows people like me to do what I do, which is fantastic and shouldn't be understated. I don't mean me specifically, but the ability to do that is absolutely amazing. But it brings with it a certain sense of transparency and therefore honesty, which is a mirage. So we have this kind of, nowhere else in the world is there quite. New Zealand is probably the next closest, and New Zealand used to have a significant problem. One of the rules it introduced that we don't have is an absolute requirement for every company to have a fully validated New Zealand resident accountable for the activity of that company. So that makes you stop and think, because you think, well, that could be quite significant. I mean, I know that there are Facebook pages that are recruiting largely vulnerable people to act as directors of companies in the UK on behalf of, well, mostly Chinese, because they're the ones who have been most active operating from abroad in creating suspicious companies. But because a lot of these people have no idea what they're getting themselves into, they're being offered 500 quid, which for some people is an awful lot of money, to have their name on a company documentation. Well, most people don't understand the legal consequences of that and are very happy to get 500 quid for signing half a dozen letters. So, the situation is really problematic, but one of the things I like telling these stories is because if you don't tell the stories, it's just paper, isn't it? It's just white collar crime, as if somehow that makes it okay, but there are always victims.
And have you followed up with any of the victims yourself to understand sort of how they felt at the end of all of
Not
this?
specifically Shiseido ones, and partly that's because I'm a private citizen, so it's not. I mean, people get in touch with me all the time, and I have ongoing conversations. I mean, one chap is a money laundering reporting officer, which is a very senior person within a bank or financial institution responsible for monitoring this sort of stuff, and his name and address was used to create a fraudulent company, so he was kind of all over that. And what we do now is that there are a few people who are very generous with their time in explaining to others what happened to them and the steps you need to go. It's now much easier because you don't need the court order anymore. Can I tell you, by the way, going back to the court orders, so I did a little bit of, in the end, the court granted 12 court orders, 4 of which were Shiseido and the other 8 were Conduent, although one of the Shiseido court orders was for 346 companies to remove all the details. So in the end, we know definitively 542 Shiseido employees and 674 Conduent employees, so that's just over 1,200, were definitively used. But I also know there are hundreds more that never got caught, picked up by these people. And I know that they work for one or the other of them whose names are still on the companies. So I would say it's probably 2,000 altogether. Wow. And sometimes the same address we use for both Shiseido and Conduent employees. So we know it's the same organised group using the data. So whether they were responsible themselves for the hack or whether they just bought these from, on the dark web from somebody who'd performed the hack, I can't tell you. I also know kind of later on in the same year, in identical circumstances, we suddenly saw a whole host of Hungarians being used to become directors of these companies. So I presume that was another data leak, because in all other respects, they were identical. So, these people still doing it. They may change their modus operandi, but data is the absolute foundation of these criminal networks, and stolen data of real people is worth a fortune.
And is there anything that we can do as individuals to kind of guard against this?
No. So there is nothing to stop you. I mean, in terms of companies, you could go home tonight and find a letter on the mat from Companies House saying, congratulations on the formation of your new company of which you know nothing. And there is nothing you can do to stop that happening, because there are so many sources of your data that if it's not guarded properly, and that's not just the people who own that data, but it's those who might have access to that data through payroll services or whatever, there are so many potential weak links in that data chain, and you rely on all of these companies to protect your data properly. Because wasn't actually that long ago when the BBC got hacked, and thousands of BBC personnel's data was stolen. And one of the things that the BBC did was to put them all on enhanced monitoring on Equifax and Experian, which are the 2 main credit reference agencies. So that the minute somebody tried to use your data for a credit of any sort, it would flag straight away as being problematic. So nobody's immune from this. Nobody.
And have the authorities managed to trace these gangs and actually prosecute in these sort of situations?
Not that I'm aware of. So one of the problems here is that they're creating these companies. I mean, you could potentially be using prepaid credit cards to pay for the formation of the company. You can certainly use, ordinary Gmail or Hotmail or whatever email addresses. You can use proxy addresses for the registration. You can do it from behind a VPN. I mean, your ability to mask your ultimate identity is almost complete. I mean, there are some things you can obviously look for commonalities. So, I mean, like, for example, if the same credit card is used for 100 companies, pretty sure that they're going to be in some way connected. But because there are 3,000 to 4,000 companies created every day in the UK. I mean, last year there were not an awful lot fewer than 1 million companies created in the year. So that's a pretty significant task to monitor across a whole massive range of different, flags to look for, which is why, it's why we do it, because it's jolly good fun. And there is nothing quite like, we have a monthly intelligence report for our subscribers, and it runs to 20 or 30 pages. And there is a certain level of excitement when you find a new network being formed. We found one a few weeks ago, and they were all being registered to a house in North London in Lady Somerset Road. And when I looked at it, and they were all Iranians, but they lived in New Zealand, in Malaysia, and in Italy, and I think, why are all these Iranians? In fact, some of the Iranians in New Zealand were neighbours because they lived. It would be the same paper round, half a dozen of them in New Zealand, all registered to this house in Lady Somerset Road. So you thought, well, that's definitely connected. And then when I looked at the house, there was a blue plaque on the house. So that's interesting, and it was Roger Lloyd Pack's house. He lived for 30 years until he died. And of course, Roger Lloyd Pack famously was Trigger in Only Fools and Horses. And you immediately think of the outro music, no income tax, no VAT. And you just think, yeah, that's about it, isn't it? There is no income tax, there is no VAT, no money back, no guarantee. It couldn't have been more like, it was one of those moments you think, well, thank you for that, because we'll make a few decent presentations from this story. But actually underlying it is they weren't Iranians, they were somebody else. I suspect Chinese for a whole host of reasons, because at the moment China is one of the largest. 30 or 40,000 Chinese individuals incorporate companies in the UK every year, and they live in some of the most remote parts of China. You just think, why? Well, I don't know why, but none of it's good.
Wow. Yeah, some of those figures are just alarming. And look, technology can be used for evil, can also be used for good. Yep. So what role are you seeing technology playing, for example, AI especially, in sort of combating this? And, with the work that you do with Risk Alert 24/7, how are you using that technology?
So at the moment, we don't need AI. Everything we do is rules-based because frankly, we can find out more than we could ever deal with just using series of rules. Having said that, I think there is going to be a role for AI and both deep and machine learning, because it is possible that there are some really, really clever criminals out there who are working out how to circumvent our kind of rules. I think it's going to be really difficult for them to do that. And I think there are reasons why that is, which is that if you are going to create these companies, creating everyone uniquely is almost impossible. They're always going to be, at the moment they're just lazy and the commonalities are just very obvious. But if you are going to need access, for example, to the post, then you can't just scatter 1,000 companies to 1,000 different addresses, because from a criminal's point of view, that's massively too difficult to manage. So concentration of address, if you're using real names, potentially using paid for names, well, you're going to probably want to use them more than once. So I think we're kind of still there, but we're always playing catch up. And AI, I think, does have the potential to because obviously it's a very large data lake, Companies House. It is probably the biggest freely available database in the world, I suspect. So the ability to let AI loose on that and start looking for patterns that we haven't seen yet is interesting. But I still think 90-odd% of all of the criminal stuff we can still identify through rules. It's just, it's creating the structure that allows us to work with the right people to stop it from happening in the first. We'll never stop it, actually, Paddy. We'll never stop it because the criminals will also be using all of that technology to create companies in a way that's even harder to detect. So it is an arms race, but that's no reason to not do it. It's just you've got to be realistic and say, well, they're always going to be at it, and our job is to try and keep on it as much as we can.
And that's a really good point. With all of this stuff, it is really difficult to stop it completely. And if this were to happen to your organization, some of the listeners out there, if this did happen in your company, how should you respond? Are there any lessons learned there from the Shiseido example?
Yeah. One of the things we do is we have for £10 a year, we'll put you on a full monitoring. So if your name or your address ever appears anywhere on a company, we let you know, which is we can't stop it happening, but the sooner you find out, the better. And now the rules actually do allow for that to be a very painless process to get all your details removed without the need for a court order, which is fantastic. It's a step, and Companies House are being very aggressive in using those powers. So since they came in March, at least 60,000 companies have had the details removed because they were delivered, Companies House say, inappropriately. What they mean is fraudulently. But in a way, that gives you a sense of the scale of this, because within months, 60,000 have been recognised to be complete. And this is long after this Shiseido stuff. I mean, long after. And of those 60,000, at least half are Chinese. So it is a significant, problem which we shouldn't duck. We need to keep beefing up the rules. We need to keep making sure that Companies House are properly resourced and has access to the right technology that will stop companies from going on the register in the first place. That would be a massive step in the right direction. But they will be working out how to get around it. So never be complacent. Your data is so incredibly valuable to people who want to use it for criminal ends that they will always be looking at ways of getting it and using it, because, they wouldn't actually want to do a day's work, would they?
So, Graham, I had a pop-up the other day saying my password has been compromised through some kind of data breach. And looking at this story of Shiseido, I'm curious to know, what actually happens to that data once it's been stolen? Yeah. Is there a sort of a step-by-step process that people go through, and how does it end up in this kind of situation that you mentioned about Companies House?
Question, and some of my response is going to be slightly speculative. I think probably most people now, there are websites called, You've Been Pwned and others, and I think now Google and others will say, you've got compromised passwords. So there's a kind of monitoring of sites on the dark web, typically, where this stuff is for sale. Now, I don't know for certain whether this was actually offered generally through the dark web or it being commissioned or whatever, because I've only seen the data really being used once, which is just interesting, because I see other people's stolen data being used repeatedly. So there's a question, but undoubtedly somebody was able to access this data from both Shiseido and from Conduent and compile a very high quality database of personally identifiable information. So there's a certain minimum requirement you're going to want, which is date of birth, current address, national insurance number. So those details that you would need. I think that's a kind of step one, if you like. So somebody got this data and now that has value, and somebody else would have commissioned the purchase of it. Now, whether that was through a dark website that was generally available or through a specific request, I can't tell you. But I suspect even the people who bought it are not necessarily the criminals who were going to ultimately benefit from it. They would be the sorts of people who know how to construct a really significant network of companies, in this case, that could then be used by criminals. We didn't talk about this yet, but one of the really interesting things about this, which was quite different from most, is that the company names were not generated algorithmically. Now, by that I mean very typically we'll see names that are just an algorithm of the directors' names. But these were actually, each one definitively was thought about and created by a human being. That's very unusual, and they did it at least 2,000 times. And so if you see Harry's Hairdressers or Camilla's Cake Shop, you think, well, that's a reasonable thing, because particularly if the director's called Harry somebody or Camilla somebody, you think, well, so actually on the surface they look like genuine companies. Camilla's Cake Shop probably wasn't going to be trading from 120 grand a year high street position in the main high street in some town in the Midlands, because it's not going to be able to afford to pay 200,000 a year by the time you had on your business rate. So there was clearly human agency involved in the creation of these companies. But it's a different skill set from most criminals who are actually after just making lots of money. So I think there were probably at least three groups involved in all of this. And I think also interestingly, and I think we've alluded to it, or if we haven't, we'll talk about it, it wasn't just these two companies. They were actually using lots of different lists of names. We had this group of Hungarians, because I was dealing with, by then, a number of different banks who we were helping to monitor to make sure they didn't become exposed to it. The minute we started seeing the Hungarian names, their response was, well, now are we finding out the real people behind this now? Why? Well, because they're Why would it make it any more likely they're the real people because they're Hungarian? That was a genuine reaction. And it is a kind of everyday racism. It's like, well, it couldn't possibly be these British people who work for Conduent and Shiseido. But these Hungarians we've never heard of, well, it could be them. Why would you suddenly start putting your real names on it? I mean, it's just crazy. So it doesn't really matter who appears on a company as a director or a PSC owner. Treat it all as potentially fraudulent because criminals are not going to go and slather their own names all over company formations,
So even those Hungarian names could potentially be real people who have been victims of this.
Absolutely, definitely real people. Probably, people who had at least at some point lived in the UK, because it makes it so much easier to get access to financial products if you have a UK residential address. And the other thing, because is that there's a third address. When you apply for a company, there are 3 addresses. 2 of them are correspondence addresses, directors and company. Third one is your underlying residential address, which you would be absolutely daft to actually include as your correspondence address because it's on company's house. But it will still be on the register because you'll need that to get through credit checking, because Equifax or Experian will require your voter's roll address or whatever. So, and we know they had those addresses too. So, they need those details, but they don't care where they come. I once saw one weekend, I saw every single flat in a block of flats in South East London have a company register to it, and every single one of them was over the age of 75. You think, well, so I've used this as an example. In fact, I eventually got in touch with one of them, lovely bloke, and it was completely fraudulent. And they also had their underlying residential addresses. But I've done this presentation about this particular one, and almost every single time somebody put their hand up and said, well, that could have been legitimate. In what way? Well, it could have been sheltered housing. Okay, so in what universe does every person in a block of flats in sheltered housing the same weekend decide to start a company? And some of them were roofing companies. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the over 75s can't be a roofer. I'm saying it's quite unlikely. And for everyone in a block of flats to create a company on the same day or the same 2 days, all of whom. So I still think, did Saga have a hack? Because actually for months we saw old elderly people's names being used on fraudulent networks. Never did find out, but I've seen companies being registered to the same road in South East London, and all of them come from a small village in Shropshire. So there's another one. At least 2 universities have been hacked. I'm not going to name names, but I know because again, lots of a network of companies. Every one of the directors went to one of these 2 particular universities. So it's not just these 2. The great thing about these 2 is the court orders, which give you such definitive evidence of what happened and to whom.
I'm just thinking as a parent, the fact that young people, sounds like young people, was it young people in the universities whose details were then used in this way? I mean, they're just starting off their career, and to start off with having that type of fraud committed, that's going to be really, really tough. Horrible. Then to do anything in life, isn't it?
It just shows you, we trust our data almost on a daily basis to firms who are going to use that data themselves for profit, or for, not in the case of universities maybe, but mostly. And when that trust is breached, the downstream effects of that can be immense. So there's a requirement on all organisations to protect your data adequately. So we talk about GDPR, but actually it's really important because it can destroy people's lives if it's not properly looked after.
Graham, it's been fascinating spending this time with you and really getting into a topic that I think many of us have probably never even thought about, because why would we? Many people out there don't own their own businesses. They've never needed to register a company on Companies House. So it's a whole new world.
Yeah.
So I think the work that you've been doing is absolutely valuable. One of the things I'm taking away from this episode is your example of somebody phones you up claiming to be a bank, give them the wrong passcode just to make sure that they are who they say they
just
are.
Every now and again. There's no harm doing it a second and they say, I'm sorry, that hasn't worked. Oh, no, sorry, I've given you, I know what I did. Let's do it again. Fine. And if they say, yes, that's fine, hang up.
Brilliant. Well, Graham, thank you so much for your time today.
Paddy.